Opportunity St. Paul is a program of Interfaith Action of Greater St. Paul, and we're super excited that you're with us tonight. We are really excited Dr. Uhuru Williams is with us tonight, one of our newest board members, and we are going to have a presentation by him, and also Professor Earl Schwartz will be leading our Interfaith text study. And to let you know, just one more time for those who are new in the room, we will be using the chat box for questions. If you need something, you feel free to use that chat box, and I have several co-hosts who are with me tonight who can help answer questions if need be and go on. But I am going to turn it over to our executive director, Randy Roth, who will help us kind of kick off the evening. So Randy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I have to say, it is actually bringing tears to my eyes to see all of your faces. It's wonderful, wonderful to see you. Thank you for being here. Interfaith Action believes that equity and opportunity grow and poverty recedes when people of faith commit themselves to making a difference. For those of you who are already Opportunity St. Paul volunteers, welcome back. And for those of you who are with us for the first time, we hope that tonight will inspire you to join Opportunity St. Paul. And Sarah will explain at the end of the meeting exactly how you do that. And for all of you, Sarah's also going to explain at the end which volunteer opportunities will be available this fall in light of COVID. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Uhuru Williams, the Distinguished University Chair and Professor and the founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas. Uhuru is a nationally known author and commentator. He's the author and/or editor of 7 books, including Rethinking the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Panthers' Portraits of an Unfinished Revolution. I'm just getting to know Uhuru in the last year, and I can tell you from his answers to questions that a lot of people would have said no to. By the way he said yes, Uhuru is not daunted by our challenges, and he brings his full force to bear on making our opportunities in this moment become realities. Uhuru is our treasured partner for building equity and opportunity in St. Paul. And as Sarah mentioned, we're just over the moon that he just joined the board of Interfaith Action. I'm gonna turn it over to Uhuru to be our main speaker, speaker for the first portion of the evening. Uhuru.
Thank you so much, Randy. How's everyone doing tonight? That's great. I am actually going to share my screen and jump right into the presentation for this evening. And I'm going to move fairly quickly because we do have a lot to cover, but I want to talk to you tonight about challenging inequality. I'm going to do that through the vehicle of something I like to call the 6 degrees of segregation, and I'll explain what I mean by that as we proceed. But I want to begin this evening by talking about James Baldwin, who wrote, "The world changes according to the way people see it. And if you can alter even by a millimeter the way people look at reality, then you can change it." Tonight with this group, I know some of you, so many of you are so well versed in this work that a lot will not be surprising to you, but I do hope to alter the way that we're thinking about our contemporary moment with regard to Black Lives Matter and the work ahead. Having said that, I want to begin with the question of how did we get here? Because I think one of the challenges that we have in our contemporary moment is that because people don't have the historical foundations to understand this moment, they tend to see this as a sudden break with history, when in fact there are a lot of through lines that we can connect to really understand how we got here and what we need to do in order to rethink or reimagine our future. And I say that because, again, when we talk about George Floyd and we think about events, not just in the Twin Cities, but in the nation over the last 2.5 months, it's very easy to see this moment as somehow separate and distinct from the long sweep of US history. When in fact, we can go back to 1905 and the Niagara movement and what I like to call a Black Lives Matter moment, where if we study the platform of the Niagara movement. Let's just take a look at a couple of these very quickly. What were they demanding? So today we hear things like defund the police or abolish the police. We talk about criminal justice reform. We worry about what's happening in the courts and what's happening in the prisons. Well, more than a century ago, here's the Niagara movement saying, in terms of courts, we demand upright judges in courts, juries selected without discrimination on account of color, and the same measure of punishment and the same efforts at reformation for Black as for white offenders. We need orphanages and farm schools for dependent children, juvenile reformatories for delinquents, and the abolition of the dehumanizing convict lease system. So we're seeing those echoes of the past. We go to public opinion. I think this is really powerful given the moment that we're in. They argue, we note with alarm the evident retrogression in this land of sound public opinion on the subject of manhood rights, Republican government, and human brotherhood. And we pray, God, that this nation will not degenerate into a mob of boasters and oppressors. Now, that's really interesting if we consider, again, our contemporary moment in leadership at the highest level. Last but not least, although we talk about health disparities as being part and parcel of a more modern context for understanding inequality and social, political, and economic inequality for people of color, here the Niagara movement in 1905 is also highlighting health and public health as a challenge to full equality. I mention that because in a way, all of us suffer to a degree from historical amnesia when we talk about social movements in this country. And a good example of that was on full display in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected president of the United States. Adam Zyglis, one of my favorite political cartoonists, produced this work, which was meant to celebrate the elevation of Barack Obama to the presidency. And Zyglis chose two really important symbols here to make the point about what he thought this moment represented. He placed Obama at the front of the bus, which obviously for most of us evokes the image of Rosa Parks at the front of the bus in 1955, Montgomery. But I also call your attention to what type of bus it is. It's a school bus. And clearly what Zyglis was trying to do was to get us to connect two watershed moments in the history of civil rights in this country, Brown versus Board of Education and a Montgomery bus boycott, and connect them to the election of the nation's first African-American president. And while that worked on a level of exciting people about Obama's campaign, it was also an important moment for us to remember that neither Thurgood Marshall nor Rosa Parks would have agreed, nor any of the organizations that we associate with the civil rights movement, that the election of an African-American president or any person of color to the highest elective office was the in and of itself of struggling for social justice and equal rights here in the United States. So you had problematic representations of what that moment represented as being the fruition of King's dream without really interrogating the depth of what these activists and others fought for. And I mention that because when Obama was elected, we know we had this moment where people were talking about a post-racial America. But as Michael Tesler has written in his most recent book, we went fairly quickly from talking about post-racial to a moment right now which feels most racial, at least in terms of how people are dealing with and talking about the issues of race. Before George Floyd, one could make the case that the nation was perhaps more racially polarized than at any point in our history. And part of what brought on that polarization was the advent of a national Black Lives Matter movement, which began after the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012 in Sanford, Florida, and which encompassed what African Americans in particular have always talked about as a perennial problem with regard to Black life, and that is the danger that Black and brown bodies experience in public spaces. This political cartoon from 2012 did a phenomenal job, again, of driving home the point of this long train of bodies of people murdered in public spaces and a lack of a public response. In fact, one could argue it wasn't until people had to watch that 8.5, almost 9 minutes of terror inflicted on George Floyd that a cartoon like this finally sunk in with regard to the terror that people of color often feel in public spaces and in encounters with police. But that in and of itself wouldn't do justice to the larger issues here, because it wasn't just Trayvon Martin. It was also the fact that in 2013, the Supreme Court decided to take on the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and in Shelby County versus Holder, eradicated key measures of that act, which ultimately have rendered voting rights for African Americans in this country, for people in this country, more vulnerable than at any other time since the 1960s. So as we're talking about an upcoming election and people are concerned about voter suppression, changing voting locations, talking about felony disfranchisement, it's important to note that, again, this came in this period where, despite the pinnacle, as some people projected, of the culmination of the civil rights movement, in fact, we have moved in this period where we were most racial. And it really took this national Black Lives Matter movement to distill what the Ferguson report wrote about in 198 pages, talking about systemic racism, to a hashtag, to a phrase, which neatly encapsulates the problem: Black Lives Matter. And part and parcel of what I want to talk to you about today is to put that movement in a larger context and talk about how that history and those foundations have to inform our work ahead. And I say this to you because, in a way, and this was a cartoon that came out after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, and it shows Barack Obama being, as he's concerned about what's happening in Russia and in Iraq and in Ukraine, being caught off guard by the unrest in his own backyard. But I think it was powerful to connect it to the work of a historian, Jacqueline Dowd Hall, who wrote about the problematic way in which we talk about the civil rights movement in this country. And she wrote this in 2005, and I want to share it with you. She said, we ultimately undermine the movement because we do a couple of things. First and foremost, we confine our discussion of civil rights struggles to the South. For most people, when we talk about the civil rights movement, when we talk about racism, when we talk about discrimination, our narrative is that that's something that happened in the Deep South, that the North was a promised land. And rarely do we talk about communities like Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, New York or Oakland or Minneapolis. And so therefore, when things happen in Ferguson, Missouri, or they happen in Minneapolis or St. Paul, there's still, on the part of some people, shock and surprise that this is a national problem, when in fact, racism has always been a national problem. She next says that we confine our conversations and our discussions to a single halcyon decade. We talk about the movement as if it began neatly in 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott and ended either in 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 or in 1968 with the assassination of the Reverend Dr. King. That in and of itself is problematic, because if we look at the activists and we look at the individuals and we look at the organizations that contributed to the movement, we first know, first and foremost, that nothing ever begins or ends neatly in that way. And secondly, just taking a few of these organizations, the Fellowship of Reconciliation comes together in 1947. The NAACP traces its history back to 1909. We can talk about John Lewis, whom we recently lost, who was born in 1940. Martin Luther King, who was born in 1929. So ultimately, we have to look at and talk about a long civil rights movement, a long struggle, and think about our battles against racial inequality and racial injustice in that context. Third, she says, we limit our discussion to limited non-economic objectives. We talk about the civil rights movement as if it was only about getting the right to vote. And in the process, we ultimately undermine one of the cornerstones of the movement much later on, where Martin Luther King in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, articulates powerfully as the idea of economic justice. As King posed the problem, what good is it to have the right to eat in a restaurant if you can't afford anything on the menu? Civil rights without economic justice are dead rights. What good is it to have the right to go to college if you can't afford tuition? Civil rights without economic justice are dead rights. And she concludes that this narrative ensures this mythology of the civil rights movement as a phase and a triumphal progress narrative that we like to tell ourselves about our history. But at the same time, it undermines its gravitas, and it prevents one of the most remarkable mass movements in American history from speaking effectively to the real challenges of our time, the challenges which connect very neatly, as I showed you, with even going back to 1905 and talking about the Niagara movement. And I mention that because this plays out in terms of how we talk about race in this country, whether we're talking about race in housing, whether we're talking about race in education, whether we're talking about race in criminal justice. This plays out in terms of how we talk about class in this country. And it certainly plays out in terms of how we talk about gender. And if we think about all of those issues then collectively, and we come to this moment, when people talk about how to be an anti-racist, or they talk about white fragility, or they talk about dealing with diversity and equity inclusion work, without the knowledge of that history, it's hard to understand how the Band-Aids that are often offered as the solution to these problems aren't enough. Wonderful cartoon from 2014 from David Fitzsimmons, pictures a young African-American child, clearly impoverished, sitting on Santa Claus's knee. And he asks of Santa, "I'd like a safe neighborhood, a good education, and white privilege." And Santa's response is, "This century?" And the title of the cartoon is, "How about a Game Boy instead?" So the Band-Aid approach to dealing with these issues of economic, social, and political inequality aren't going to be enough. I share that because in a way, and we are talking about, now talking in the aftermath of the passage of John Lewis, who gave us 65 years of service of his life, joining the movement at 15, being the youngest speaker at the March on Washington in 1963 at 23, passing in 2020, to ask these three interrelated questions. How can we connect the Black Lives Matter movement with other struggles for civil rights and social justice in the United States and beyond? How do we use these connections as an opportunity to reimagine thoughtful engagement around combating racism? And last but not least, how can our study and understanding of this history inform our contemporary responses and efforts to tackle racial injustice? And in a way, we also have to situate John Lewis in conversation with Stokely Carmichael, who in 1966 in the New York Review of Books pointed the finger at all of us who don't respond when we are challenged with oppression in a way that demands action. What Carmichael wrote in 1966, speaking about a very different era and a very different moment, which still resonates, is that, quote, "In a sense, I blame ourselves together with the mass media for what has happened in Watts and in Harlem, Chicago, Cleveland, Omaha. Every time the people in those cities saw Martin Luther King get slapped, they became angry. When they saw 4 little Black girls bombed to death, they were angrier. And when nothing happened, they were steaming. We had nothing to offer they could see except to go out and be beaten again. We helped to build their frustration." In this moment, it's important for us to think about ways not only to diffuse frustration, but to actually help to build hope through engaging opportunity. And that's what Interfaith does. It's why I'm a part of this organization. But I think these historical foundations are important in terms of setting the table for how we proceed. Having said that, we have to reject this notion of Minnesota exceptionalism. The reality is that what happened in Minneapolis happens in the United States across the board, has happened historically. And if we view George Floyd's murder in that context, we do ourselves a disservice in understanding how deeply the roots of racial injustice run in our country. We also, again, have to remember George Floyd in the context of Philando Castile and Jamar Clark and other episodes of racial violence in this community. And I mention that again because without that history, George Floyd becomes a singular case, when in fact, if we look at him in the context of these other cases, it's a reminder that this is a long struggle. It's a long battle, a deeper enterprise in which we're engaged. And at the core, this is a struggle against white supremacy. Thomas Nast captured this in 1868 in this famous cartoon depicting what happened in the aftermath of Reconstruction, where you had this moment after the Civil War where there's great promise for the future. And then ultimately the nation reverts to this form of Jim Crow justice, Jim Crow government, which undermines the gravitas of that moment. And I mention that again because it's not then simply questions of talking about what happens to African Americans, but also how that influences questions of immigration and questions of how we deal with Native Americans as well. I share 2 cartoons here, both in and of themselves disturbing. One, a depiction of Uncle Sam turning his nose up at immigrants, and you can see the racist depiction of the immigrants based on ethnicity. And another very famous cartoon from 1879, "Every dog, no distinction of color, has his day." I think it's one of my favorite cartoons, and I'm gonna move up closer here. It shows Native Americans speaking to a Chinese immigrant, and you can see written on the wall or the laws, the anti-Chinese immigration laws. And the Native American says to the Chinese gentleman, I'm gonna read this to you, "Red gentleman to yellow gentleman, pale face, afraid he'll crowd you out like he did me." But if you look carefully over the head of the African-American gentleman in the back is written the words, "My day is a-comin'." And it's a really powerful testimony and document from 1879 that shows that less than a decade out of Reconstruction, after the end of Reconstruction, how the issues of race, how the treatment of indigenous peoples, and how the issues of immigration are bound up, particularly as they concern people of color in the United States. We can look at that then in the context of comparing the old immigrants versus the new immigrants, who's coming to the United States, and the political responses to those people as they arrive. The Chinese Exclusion Act from 1882, the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan to keep Japanese immigrants out of the United States of 1907, the Alien Land Acts of 1911 and 1913 in California, the adoption of quotas and racial preferences. And all of these are efforts, again, to color, to borrow a metaphor, and to prevent these peoples from establishing a footing in the United States equal with those of the so-called pureblood whites. And I share that with you again because if we look at it in this context, then all of a sudden our conversations about racial inequality then can give us a broader window into how we talk about tackling issues of housing, education, police brutality, Jim Crow justice, and I'll share more about that in just a second. But I also want to distinguish early on with you the difference between a movement and a moment, because sometimes we assume that every time there is an episode, that's a movement. And sometimes there's simply moments or a portion of time that we can point to that really encapsulates the frustration, the anger, and the roots of the problems that we continue to see that continue to manifest themselves in our larger society. I would argue that today we are in the midst of a movement with regard to Black Lives Matter. And I want to share that with you by talking about Ralph Ellison's book, Invisible Man, which he published in 1952. I think in a way, there's no better way to give you a sense of the Black Lives Matter movement, as I understand it, than talking about Ellison and his meditation about what it means to be invisible in a larger society. So I'm going to read this to you, and I'm going to share with you that if you don't know Ellison, it's going to be very hard to understand, in some sense, the symbolism in the language adopted by Black Lives Matter. Ellison wrote in 52, "I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you sometimes see in circus sideshows, it's though I'm surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me." If you were to apply that in terms of what we've seen just in the last year alone, and you were to substitute Ahmaud Arbery or Breonna Taylor or George Floyd, and you were to ask yourselves what the individuals who committed murder against those people saw in that moment, did they see them as human? Did they see them as people? Or did they see them through the lens of the hard, distorting glass that Ellison talks about? Did they only see their surroundings, North Minneapolis? Did they only see themselves, their fear of people of color, or figments of their imagination encouraged by the American media? Whatever the case, they saw everything and anything except those people as individuals. But here's where the movement really becomes critical in this conversation, because Ellison writes, "I remember that I'm invisible and I walk softly so as not to awake the sleeping ones. Sometimes it's best not to awaken them. There are few things in the world as dangerous as sleepwalkers." I think where Black Lives Matter differs from this 1952 moment that we're talking about with Ellison here is that they're saying, wake the sleepwalkers up, because we can no longer afford to live in a world, in a nation where sleepwalkers dominate. Part of that terminology around stay woke and being woke is a response to speaking out against racism, challenging inequality, not being silent, understanding that silence is violence in that sense, because silence helps to perpetuate that type of injustice. Having said that, we see this problem of invisibility now in our culture in various ways. And it's expressed not only in politics, but also in popular culture, in music, and in a whole genre of horror now, represented by Jordan Peele and his movies Us. And part and parcel of talking about that cultural turn is also recognizing that in the literature itself, if you don't know this history, you're lost to understand the connectivity between these periods of time and these movements. A lot of people read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, but if you don't know W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folks, you wouldn't know that Ta-Nehisi Coates is actually taking the words from chapter 3 of The Souls of Black Folks and flipping them around. Coates says, between the world and me, Du Bois says, between me and the other world. And Du Bois, in his meditation here, says there's this ever unasked question about Black people, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through difficulty of rightly framing. All nevertheless flutter around it. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then instead of saying directly, how does it feel to be a problem? They say, I know an excellent colored man, or I fought at Mechanicsville, or do not these Southern outrages make your blood boil? In other words, Dubois in 1903 is in conversation with Ralph Ellison from 1952 and saying, he is in essence invisible. Ta-Nehisi Coates makes the same argument in Between the World and Me. Making those connections in a powerful way allows us to understand that this contemporary moment extends beyond just what we're seeing now. But I do want to, and I hope this is going to work, play Al Sharpton's, or 2 minutes of Al Sharpton's speech or eulogy for George Floyd. And the reason I want to share this with you is, although I'm not a huge fan of Al Sharpton, I think in this moment, he captures something very powerful that helps us see the connective tissue that runs across these generations, these decades, these centuries, as we talk about racial inequality. And he provides us a very powerful metaphor in the knee. I want to share that, and then I want to pick up on the second half of this. Let's hope that this works. Hopefully everybody can let me know if you hear this.
George Floyd's story has been the story of Black folks, because ever since 401 years ago, the reason we could never be who we wanted and dreamed of being is you kept your knee on our neck. We were smarter than the underfunded schools you put us in, but you had your knee on our neck. We could run corporations and not hustle in the street, but you had your knee on our neck. We had creative skills. We could do whatever anybody else could do, but we couldn't get your knee off our neck. What happened to Floyd happens every day in this country, in education, in health services, and in every area of American life. It's time for us to stand up in George's name and say, get your knee off our necks. But George.
What's really powerful then about Reverend Sharpton's commentary there and that use of the metaphor of the knee allows us to go back and look at what happens in the immediate aftermath of Reconstruction. And I wanted you to take a look at this very disturbing political cartoon from 1863, just after Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The caption reads, "The man who won the elephant at the raffle, but the question is, what am I to do with the creature?" And it really posits a very simple question. Congratulations, Mr. Lincoln and Republican Party. You just freed 4.5 million people who were once enslaved. Now what? What's their social status going to be in the Republic? What's their political status going to be? What's their economic status going to be? And if you're not prepared to answer that question in a way that's affirmative, not only of the dignity of their lives, but to give them real opportunity, you're going to introduce into the Republic a source of chaos and disorder, which will not be easily resolved. And we all know that, unfortunately, despite the optimism and opportunity of that moment, that's precisely what happened. In fact, I want to share with you a speech that Frederick Douglass gave before the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society in 1865. And I'm going to tell you that Frederick Douglass is going to foreshadow the next 100 years of US history. He's invited by this predominantly white audience to address the question, what does the Black man want? And if you listen carefully, you can see this connection, this conversation between Al Sharpton and Frederick Douglass. Douglass responds, "What shall we do with the Negro? I've had but one answer from the beginning. Do nothing with us. Your doing with us has already played the mischief with us. Do nothing with us. If the apples will not remain on the tree of their own strength, if they're worm-eaten at the core, if they're early ripe and disposed to fall, let them fall. I'm not for tying or fastening them on the tree in any way except by nature's plan. And if they will not stay there, let them fall. And if the Negro cannot stand on his own legs, let him fall also." This shouldn't be surprising to anyone because Douglas is a contemporary both of Charles Darwin and Herbert Spencer. And what you're seeing here is this strain of social Darwinism. But I want to be clear that the reason that Douglas is doing this is tied to what follows next. And I also want to be very clear that this is the part where he's going to foreshadow that 100 years and where he's clearly in conversation with Reverend Sharpton. He says, all I ask is give him a chance to stand on his own legs. Leave him alone, let him alone. Listen carefully. If you see him on his way to school, let him alone, don't disturb him. Fast forward 100 years to Little Rock. Fast forward to forced busing in Boston. Fast forward to the major battles over the desegregation of schools that occurred after the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education. Douglas next says, if you see him going to the dinner table at a hotel, fast forward to 1960 in the Freedom Rides. See the images of Freedom Riders such as John Lewis, beaten for trying to desegregate lunch counters and restrooms. And then consider the way in which the racialization of public space continues that practice today. Last but not least, Douglas says, if you see him going to the ballot box, trying to exercise his right to vote, let him alone, don't disturb him. And Douglas is interrupted at this point by applause because the people in the audience recognize or think that this is sound advice. And yet, we all know that no sooner is the ink dry in the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment than no less than 7 major pieces of legislation that are passed between 1865 and 1875 meant to ensure absolute equality before the law for people of color, that the response is the antithesis of what Douglas called for. We get sharecropping, the crop lien system, poll tax, grandfather clause, literacy tests, all of these devices meant to relegate Blacks to the position they occupied when they were enslaved. And in fact, that's where we get to what I like to call these 6 degrees of segregation. Because what you see is segregation emerging in these 6 key areas: residential segregation, segregation in education, a denial of access to places of public accommodation, the practice of Jim Crow justice, a denial of voting rights, and unfair labor practices and unfair employment. And if we look at it in that context, and then we fast forward to 1963, 100 years later, here's the cartoonist Herblock in 1963, and what does he depict? Here, he shows an African-American demonstrator being shoved off the sidewalk by a white gentleman, and the caption reads, "And remember, nothing can be accomplished by taking to the streets." But what is the protester out trying to draw attention to? Housing restricted, school restricted, public accommodations restricted, job opportunities restricted. If we look at it in the context of the conversation that followed the murder of George Floyd, this is the systemic racism. This is the prejudice that we've been talking about. This is the public health crisis as is expressed in tangible forms in all aspects of our society and culture. We don't only talk about this with regard to African Americans, we can also see it in the treatment of indigenous people, namely Native Americans. We talk about defunding the police, but maybe this would have been helpful to defund the cavalry, because part of the problem here is that when we talk about Native peoples and indigenous peoples and their struggles, here's Chief Joseph in 1870 asking the very same things, making essentially the same speech that Frederick Douglass made with regard to what Native peoples desired. Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to talk, think, and act for myself, and I will obey every law or submit to the penalty. What's powerful about that for us is that then we can look at the overlap in these movements and understand the ways in which they're connected, and really then think critically about how we address what is not a localized problem, but a national problem, one which we can identify over the course of our history in people like Susie King Taylor, the African-American nurse from Boston, who in 1912 talked about the North being just as corrupt and just as dangerous for African-Americans as the South. We can see it in the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who reminded us in his book that sincerity and conscientiousness in and of themselves are not enough. History, he argued, has proven these noble virtues may degenerate into tragic vices. Nothing, he argued, in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. And to not have a historical foundation in some sense places us in danger of proceeding from that standpoint. In that sense, you can see the foolishness, the folly of people like Pratt, who made the case that in order to save the Indian, in order to save the man, they had to kill the Indian. I mean, history is full of these types of moments, which should demonstrate to us the dangers of proceeding quickly without understanding or doing the hard work of listening and trying to understand where people are coming from. And if we talk about Native cultures, then it's not the same knee that Al Sharpton talked about, but there is a knee, and we can see it in the timeline. I'm just dealing in the same period here, from 1866 down to 1881, and the atrocities that are carried out against Native peoples, often at the end of a bayonet, at the end of the cavalry. And this is part and parcel of the problem. When we can make those connections powerfully and understand that in these ways, we can then really understand what Stokely Carmichael meant in 1966 when he wrote in the New York Review of Books. I remember that when I was a boy, I used to see Tarzan movies on Saturday. White Tarzan used to beat up the Black natives, and I would sit there yelling, "Kill the beasts, kill the savages, kill them." I was saying, "Kill me." It was as if a Jewish boy watched Nazis taking Jews off to the concentration camps and cheered them on. Today, I want the chief to beat the hell out of Tarzan and send him back to Europe. But it takes time to reject the most important lie, that Black people inherently can't do the same things white people can do unless white people help them. Wounds produce narratives, and in a way, when we see that anger and frustration, that leads people to believe that at this stage, there's no room for peaceful compromise or incremental change. That's where that frustration comes from the wound. That's why on the 40th anniversary of Wounded Knee in 1973, you get armed Native peoples making their case, and it's why you get the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in 1966, arming for self-defense in response to the wound. I want to end with you tonight by talking just a little bit about how these shadows, echoes, fingerprints, and footprints of the past really can illuminate for us a pathway forward. So if we focus so narrowly on our contemporary moment, and Colin Kaepernick and taking a knee, we forget to interrogate James Baldwin, who in 1964 talked about policing. In fact, Baldwin wrote, similarly, the only way to police a ghetto is to be oppressive. None of Commissioner Kennedy's policemen, even with the best will in the world, have any understanding of the lives of the people they swagger about in twos and threes controlling. Their very presence is an insult, and it would be even if they spent their entire day feeding gumdrops to children. They represent the force of the white world, and that world's real intentions are simply for that world's criminal profit. The badge, the gun in the holster, and the swinging club make vivid what will happen should this rebellion become overt. Rare indeed, he wrote, is the Harlem citizen, from the most circumspect church member to the most shiftless adolescent, who does not have a long tale to tell of police incompetence, injustice, or brutality. If we put Baldwin's words from '64 up against this cartoon from Daryl Cagle from 2014, where here's this police officer decked out with the surplus gear from the failed war in Iraq and Afghanistan, who's there to serve and protect, but who looks more like he's going to occupy foreign territory than to protect people in the neighborhood, we can understand the depth of that wound and why this history becomes so important. In fact, it allows us to look at Newark, New Jersey in 1967, 12-year-old Joe Bass Jr. shotgunned by National Guardsmen in Newark for looting. Why so many people were so deeply hurt and offended when the President of the United States used the language, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. The irony of 12-year-old Joe Bass Jr. on the cover of Life magazine bleeding out for property. And the reality that at least in 1967, that's the National Guard. By the time we get to Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, the local police are better armed than the National Guard were in 1967. And what does that communicate to the people in the communities they are supposed to serve? I know I'm running out of time, but I want to mention to you that this is a story that, as Baldwin said, touches most Black lives. So even Jackie Robinson in 1964 commented powerfully on police brutality in New York, saying, "I think our police commissioner must be warned that police brutality will not be tolerated by the Negro and Puerto Rican people of New York City. There's been too much of it, and unless it's seriously curtailed, there can be serious and crucial times ahead for the city." When we can see this and we can track it across time, it reinforces this notion that American tragedies have always been born of our failure to live by our core democratic values. And we can see that in a myriad ways I don't have time to talk about tonight. But if we think about those core democratic values, this is how the National Council for the Social Studies defines them for elementary students. They are life, the pursuit of happiness, liberty, justice, popular sovereignty, truth, common good, equality, diversity, and patriotism. We understand why that wound has produced a narrative where people say, maybe in this moment it's important to think about not just reform, but wholesale abolition to get to a place where we can build a society that more reflects these values than trying to reform a society which in some sense was built to deny the same to such large portions of the population, particularly communities of color. Last but not least, and I promise my last 3 slides, we have Martin Luther King Jr. in the aftermath of the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson, actually explained to all of us how this is a societal problem that moves beyond the agent of the destruction itself. The police are simply a symptom of a much larger disease. As King said at the eulogy of Jimmy Lee Jackson, a state trooper pointed the gun that killed Jimmy Lee Jackson, but that trooper did not act alone. Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered by the brutality of every sheriff who practices lawlessness in the name of the law. He was murdered by the irresponsibility of every politician, from governors on down, who has fed his constituents the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. He was murdered by the timidity of a federal government that can spend millions of dollars a day to keep troops in the South Vietnam and cannot protect the rights of its own citizens seeking the right to vote at home. He was murdered by the indifference of every white minister of the gospel who's remained silent behind the safe security of his stained glass windows. And he was murdered by the cowardice of every Negro who passively accepts the evils of segregation and stands on the sidelines for justice. In indicting all of us, King in some sense reminds us that the Black Revolution as he saw it, as Rosa Parks saw it, as Ella Baker saw it, as so many of the people that we associate as architects of this movement, from Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph all down, that the Black Revolution was much more than a struggle for the rights of Negroes. It was forcing America to face all of its interrelated flaws: racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. And he concludes, it is exposing evils that are rooted so deeply in the whole structure of our society and suggests that radical reconstruction of society is the real issue to be faced. It puts us then in the mindset to be able to understand why Ferguson, Missouri in 2014 now looks a lot like Tiananmen Square in 1989. It puts us in a position, therefore, to be receptive to the words of John Lewis at the March on Washington when he commanded all of us at 23 years old to understand that to those who have said be patient and wait, we must say patience is a dirty and nasty word. We cannot be patient. We do not want to be free gradually. We want our freedom and we want it now. We cannot depend on any political party, for both the Democrats and the Republicans have betrayed the basic principles, the core democratic values of the Declaration of Independence. And if we think about this again in the context of the national Black Lives Matter movement now, this is what we can take from the hashtag, from the strong women and men who have helped to define that movement and moved it forward, from the defiant voices of youth in the streets of America who are compelling us to interrogate all aspects of our society, to really think concretely now about how we root out those 6 degrees of segregation. But in the immortal words of John Lewis, all of us must get in the revolution and stay in. Stay in the streets of every city, every village, every hamlet of this nation until freedom comes, until the revolution is complete. In the Delta of Mississippi, in Southwest Georgia and Alabama, Harlem, Detroit, Philadelphia, all over the nation, the Black masses are on the march. The one thing that I really appreciated about Al Sharpton is that he also recognized that in this moment, it's not just the Black masses that are in the streets. It is a rainbow of people who are in the streets who seem in this moment really determined to make a case for how if we want to have a more perfect union, if we want to build a just society, if we want to live up to that value proposition, then we all have to get in and stay in the fight. Thank you.
Thank you. You're getting applause. You're getting applause from a lot of folks, which is great. We do have a couple of questions here before we move on to our interfaith text study. I just want to encourage anyone else on our call who has questions, feel free to use that chat box. It's located on the bottom. Our first question comes from Vic, who's one of our longtime volunteers and supporters of Interfaith. He asked, can you comment on the reparations effort in the United States, and can reparations help happen without a form of truth and reconciliation, and has been done in other countries.
Actually, Vic, I agree with you. You need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States, the likes of which we saw in South Africa. That work is going to be so fundamental to our ability to really talk about moving forward, and talking about really what would be a new day one. Because I think at this point, reparations alone, or the conversation around reparations alone, gets lost in what I framed in the very beginning, the fact that very few people have historical consciousness. So I think about what happened in the aftermath of George Floyd. 2 weeks after, we were celebrating Juneteenth. We were talking about the Duluth lynching. We were talking about the Tulsa race riot of 1921. And I can't tell you how many people said to me, I never heard any of that history before. And it's hard to invest people in the idea that we need reparations when they don't know what the reparations are for. They just don't have that historical knowledge. So I think you need that truth and reconciliation component, to basically just provide that baseline of knowledge, but then also to be in a position where, as Martin Luther King stated in 1967, you have to have that point where there's redemption. Remember, the slogan of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was to redeem the soul of America. And redemption means that people can make mistakes, but we've got to build a big enough tent to welcome everybody back home, to build the society, the beloved community that we all embrace and that we all want.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm responding to a chat, sorry about that. Another comment, can you comment on what the oppressed and the oppressor should start doing to get where we want to be? What can we do?
Wow, such a great question. I'd say what you can do is think concretely about the ways where you can have impact. Martin Luther King called it ripples of hope. I love what Interfaith is doing. I think Interfaith lives humbly for justice. I think a lot of the conversation now, there's so many people who are looking for, there's a new sense of immediacy. And so many people want to solve this issue overnight. We didn't build this house of inequality overnight, and we're not going to dismantle it overnight. So what we need are people like John Lewis who are willing to get in at whatever stage and commit their lives to a life of service and justice. We also should understand from that history lesson that we always watch these things go in cycles. So freedom is a constant struggle. It requires vigilance. We're always going to have to be on the lookout and prepared to address issues like this so that we don't put ourselves in a position where we believe that some piece of legislation or somebody occupying an office is the end result of our struggle. The end result of our struggle is when we live in a society where we no longer have to worry about electing people to office or drafting legislation to deal with that inequality. And in that sense, I celebrate C.T. Vivian and John Lewis as wonderful examples of what it means to live a life of service. Lewis did on a national stage as a congressman. Very few people knew what C.T. Vivian did, but there was no break in his activism from the 1950s and 1960s. He just lived humbly for justice. And I think you find ways to do that like all of you are doing through your engagement with Interfaith. And because again, I want to say this, and I think we need to say this more. It doesn't matter sometimes that people don't know what you're doing. When you're working toward the solution, no matter how small or how insignificant it may seem to you, those are the things that are chipping away at Jericho's wall, and that ultimately will bring that wall down.
Wonderful. I'm going to let Randy ask her question.
Uhuru, we're aware that you're a scholar of the period of time the Black Panther movement was in place in New Haven, maybe the 70s. Is there anything that you learned in the study of that work that informs your thinking about what we should be doing in this moment?
Thank you, Randy. Great question. And yes, we often think of the Panthers, for most of us, are fixed in 1966 in Oakland, California, and their armed patrols of the police. But in 1968, they put down the gun and they issued what they called the Serve the People initiatives. And this was all about community programs. And this is where some of their great community work actually came to the fore. So the Breakfast for School Children program, child care program, their free health clinics, of which they had 13 across the country. Their prison busing program, the most successful of which was operated in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So the Panthers were saying, in any community in which we operate, we're going to do three things. We're going to listen to the community first. We're going to figure out what their needs are. And then we're going to craft responses that allow us to meet the needs of those people who live in that community in an organic way. So we're not going to come in with a one size fits all, this is what we do. We're going to come in and say, how could we best be of service? What I loved about New Haven is that manifested itself in two programs which endured to this day, even though the Panthers are long gone. They were the ones who pushed Yale University to start a free health clinic, and Operation Head Start, which we all know, that guarantees young people a healthy, nutritious breakfast in the morning. We wouldn't have known that without the Panthers, but they did that without government backing. They did that without financial support. They simply recognized that this is what needed to be done, and they did the work, and they let the world catch up to them. And I think sometimes what I'm inspired by their model is sometimes we just have to let the world catch up to us, but we have to find a way to do that work in the interim.
Thank you so much. And I have one more question for you. You are the founding director of the new Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas. Can you tell us a little bit about what are your plans? What kind of work can we expect to see from the Institute? What are your dreams for it?
Well, right now I'm in that listening phase that I just talked about, learning from the Panthers, but the bulk of that work is to support organizations like Interfaith and the YWCA. To the extent that universities can offer academic support, can leverage the intellectual brain power that we have there, that can be facilitators, but most importantly, to listen and to figure out ways in which we can match that research to what people are already doing in the community, because there's so much great work that's happening. But sometimes we operate in silos and we show up in spaces and think that, we're reinventing the wheel. Sometimes we just have to find out where that work is happening and then figure out how to best use whatever talents we have in support of that work. A lot of what I'll be doing with RJI is historical recovery. I think this is absolutely essential. Someone has to be out and kind of set the baseline and help people understand why there's a conversation about defund the police, why there's a conversation about reparations, why there are conversations about housing and redlining and prison industrial complex. But then after we have that conversation, finding ways to direct people in the orbit of those organizations that are doing the hard work of dismantling, like Interfaith in terms of housing and prison and legal services, like the YWCA in terms of dismantling racism and tackling issues of housing. But for me right now, at least initially, that work is going to be on historical recovery.
Great. I'm going to throw back to Sarah in just one second, but our chat line is buzzing with people wanting to know, will we be able to see the PowerPoint? Will we be able to see a recording? So could you just comment on what you'll allow Interfaith to share with the community?
I think we're going to share the video, right? And a PDF of the presentation that you'll be able to flip. I know I ran through a lot of those slides quickly, so we'll definitely make sure you get the PDF.
Thank you so much. Sarah.
I just had another question pop up because I gave folks just one more second. This comes from a coworker of mine. What can people do to learn more and stay woke?
It's a great question. I think right now, just to be very intentional and purposeful about finding spaces to be vulnerable and to listen. And I think that applies across the board. I love Dr. King's indictment of all of us in that, so that people of color aren't off the hook. No one's off the hook in this conversation. There are things that we all need to learn. I've learned a lot in the last 2 months about things that, quite frankly, I never associated with the core of my work. I had a great conversation the other day with a young architect of color, who was talking about in his work, the fact that part of the reason he can't get work is that when he will show up for an interview, the way that he's frozen out of that industry is they'll say, well, we'd like to go with you, but we need we don't know you've done 20 other projects like this. So it's always this process of understanding the ways in which racial discrimination impact people in various quarters. For me, the other thing, before I left Connecticut, I was involved in the push for universal pre-K. I think right now, as we're talking about reimagining neighborhoods, and as we're suffering through this pandemic of COVID-19, now more than ever, the idea of reimagining communities around social services, around job training programs, around universal pre-K, so we can really function as communities become important. So I think when people talk about staying woke, for me, it's part and parcel of finding the space to do, again, and as a historian, I'm not just saying this because I'm a historian, we don't know what we don't know. And unless we create opportunities to be exposed to that information, we can't grow. But then secondly, being vulnerable enough to just admit and to put yourself in spaces where people can educate you about their travails, and then be intentional, as Randy does very brilliantly all the time, about connecting dots. The people that I think are the most magical and the most special, it's why we all love John Lewis so much, is he always was a master of connecting the dots.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It is just an amazing, the chat box is going crazy. Everyone else is just loving this. We need to move on to our interfaith text study. So again, Uhuru, we thank you. We're so excited to be partnering with you and working with you, and just excited to continue our conversations. Please know that we are going to do some more education and hopefully invite Dr. Williams back to join us a little further. I'm going to, pass it back to Randy to introduce our interfaith text study for our leader for the evening. So Randy.
First, I would like to thank Uhuru. That was an amazing amount of exactly what we're all trying to hold on to. And so thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for joining our board. Thank you for bringing all of you to strengthen this effort. Excuse me. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Earl Schwartz. Earl is a member of the Hamlin University Religion faculty. Earl has taught in Hamlin's College of Liberal Arts, the law school, and the graduate liberal arts program. He directed Hamlin's interdisciplinary program in social justice from its inception in 1999 through 2016. Earl is a beloved teacher throughout the Jewish community, teaching and sparking foundational shifts in thinking for both children and adults throughout the community. He's the author of numerous books and articles on Jewish education, moral education, literature, history, and in Earl's own words, he's an eager participant in Opportunity St. Paul gatherings. How very fortunate for us. Welcome, Earl.
Thank you so much, Randy. I deeply appreciate being able to study with you. And thank you to Opportunity St. Paul and Interfaith Action for bringing all of us together in this way. This evening, I would once again like to complete the circle of themes that each year we've passed through in our gatherings together, from friend to family, to stranger, to adversary, and this evening to community. And I hope that in the course of our study together this evening, if something from previous sessions comes to you, that in your groups or together, you make those connections for us. But this evening, my focus is on the theme of community, and my text will be from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. In all of the Hebrew Bible, there are only two passages in which declarations are designated for regular recitation by Israelites. And both of those passages happen to be found in the 26th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. The second of these passages, in verses 12 through 15, has to do with the payment of a tithe assessed every third year for the support of immigrants, orphans, widows, and Levites. That is, people most likely not to have access to farmland and therefore economically vulnerable. And this passage concludes with the declaration to be made when this tithe has been properly paid. But our focus this evening will be on the passage that immediately precedes it, which also is a declaration that Israelites were expected to make publicly. This preceding passage has to do with yet another levy, assessment on Israelites. In this case, a levy on the first fruits of those who were able to farm, which was to be brought each year to the temple in Jerusalem. You see that text in front of you now. As has been our practice over the years, we'll take a look at this primary text. Then I want to share with you a classical commentator's observation on the text. And as you'll recall, we do this because perhaps some of us might hesitate to go after a biblical text or a text from another sacred tradition, lest we offend or seem to presume what we might fear we will be offensive for. We begin the conversation then with a commentator who starts the reading of the text critically for us. And in this way, we join an ongoing conversation about that text. So here is that passage, the opening of Deuteronomy chapter 26. Take some of the first fruits of the soil grown from your land that the Eternal your God is giving you, put it in a basket, and go to the place where the Eternal your God will choose to place God's name there. Come to the priest of that time and say to him, I declare today to the Eternal, or alternately in some texts, your God or my God, that I have come to the land the Eternal promised our ancestors would be given to us. Then the priest will take the basket from your hand and place it before the altar of the Eternal your God. Then you respond by saying before the Eternal your God, my ancestor was an Aramean in peril. And let me stop at this point just to say, this translation is mine, and the word I've translated as peril is exceedingly difficult and nuanced in the Hebrew. It has the following connotations. It does mean peril. It means about to perish. It means stray. It means errant. It means disappearing, all of which I thought could best be conveyed with the word peril. But perhaps as we discuss this passage, you'll want to keep all of those possibilities in mind. My ancestor was an Aramean in peril who went down to Egypt and was an immigrant there, just a few of them, and became a great nation there, strong and many. The Egyptians treated us badly, impoverished us, and subjected us to hard labor. And we cried out to the Eternal, the God of our ancestors, and the Eternal heard our voices, saw our poverty and our toil and our oppressed condition. And the Eternal took us out of Egypt by force, powerfully reaching out, frighteningly, and with signs and portents, and then brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And here now, I've brought the first fruits of the land that you, the Eternal, have given me. Before we go to Avraham Ibn Ezra's comment about the passage, let me remind us of an old friend, Deanna Thompson. Professor Thompson, a few years back, wrote a commentary on the book of Deuteronomy. And in that commentary, on the passage I've just read, Deanna says, The words uttered in these verses are often referred to as a credo. She then goes on to say that within some religious communities, especially in recent generations, the notion of having a religious creed that one recites has been criticized, that many see it as a kind of reflex, a rite rather than an expression of faith, and she explores what the value of such recitations might be. In a moment, I'll ask us to think about how, if we understand the passage before us as a creed to be recited as a statement of faith, how it compares with creeds that you might be more familiar with, Christian creeds, or the Shahada in Islam, or perhaps Maimonides' 13 Principles. If this is a creed, what is this creedal form and content all about? But before we do that, let's go to Ibn Ezra's comments. He says, regarding that difficult to translate word, imperil, why is that the first description given of the person who's reciting's ancestry? An ancestry imperiled. Ibn Ezra says it's simple. It's about poverty. It's about without possessions. And then the reference to the ancestor. And he says, why that? Why would I begin a statement of this sort, not with me, but with an earlier generation? And he says, it's because one has to understand as an Israelite that one didn't get the land from their ancestors. They were, and once again he returns to impoverished. They were immigrants. They came from somewhere else. And then was an immigrant in Egypt as well. And all their connection to this land depends on now is a gift of God. I didn't inherit it. I didn't deserve it. I received it as a gift. Having said that, and giving you a moment to think over this passage, let me ask that first question in the questions on the sheet that you've seen. Anyone have any thoughts about what a creed of this sort might mean as compared with creeds that you may be more familiar with, creedal statements that perhaps you recite weekly, monthly, in church, or in a mosque? Would anyone like to begin that conversation briefly? How is it different? In what sense is it perhaps surprising to describe such a passage as creedal? What might you
Earl, I
expect?
just shared.
Yes.
I just shared the question in the chat box.
Yes,
And
thank you.
you let me know when you want to, if you want to split out into breakout rooms, we can do that too.
Thank you. Let me see that question. If you think, I guess, good, perfect.
So feel free to use the chat box to share an answer with us right now.
Yes.
And we may move into
Just an
breakout
initial
rooms.
observation if anyone has it. How does it compare and contrast with what you would typically think a creed might contain? Any thoughts? Well, what in creeds that you and I know best is usually the first line. How do creeds that we might be most familiar with almost always begin? Yes, thanks, Nan. Creeds typically begin with a statement of belief. A statement of belief that almost always starts with, I believe in one God, the God, a God. This creed, as Jamie says, hi Jamie, thank you, seems to be a narrative. It starts not in heaven, but squarely on earth, about as earthy and grounded as it gets. Any other initial thoughts about what's peculiar about thinking of this in terms of a creed? Yes, Elaine, thank you. It's a story, it's a history. And this particular story is rife with expression of thanks. If there's something that human beings are called upon to do in this particular passage, it's to acknowledge gifts. Let me just say, in the Hebrew, the word to give appears 7 times in the passage. 3 at the beginning, 3 at the end, and 1 in the middle. And the subject of those givings are never the Israelite. The Israelite never describes what they're doing with their first fruits as giving them. God gives. The Egyptians in the middle of the passage gave us oppression. At the end of the passage again, God gives. This is a story, and it's a story about acknowledging gifts. Now with that, let me ask that we go into some small groups for a few minutes and consider the second question. If Sarah, you could please put that up again for us. The second of the 2 questions. If this is a very peculiar way of thinking about a creed, that it's a narrative, that it doesn't begin with God, it begins in the world with me and my ancestors. If it's a story, what is it about this story that is implicitly or explicitly about community? Creeds are typically something that you say because you share them. What's the creedal sharing in this case? And Sarah, I think we're ready for a few minutes of small group conversation. Before we close, let me please quickly ask, were there any interesting observations that somebody would like to share from the breakout groups regarding either question? How this notion that what we're looking at in our passage tonight should be understood as a kind of creedal statement compares or contrasts with what we might be more familiar with as a creed.
I'm gonna call on Stuart. He was trying to jump in here. Stuart, unmute yourself and share.
Well, everything that we all said was interesting. The idea, as a Jew, I don't know about other creeds. I don't know about creeds. So it's interesting to hear the perspectives of people who have a Christian background about how, for some, it seemed like it was a creed was an imperial decree. For someone else, it was something that was said in the Methodist Church, but really didn't, quote unquote, mean anything, just something we say because we're coerced into saying it. And then there was another opinion that I think Reverend Claxton was trying to explain when we were all cut off, and he had a very interesting point in which he disagreed with Reverend Abbott. And we didn't get to hear that. But that was interesting concepts about good creed, bad creed, no creed, communal creed. It was very interesting.
And creed as story. Yes. And perhaps one more observation from a group about either question? Anything about what's communal about the passage?
Well, Annie Roth Bloomford, I have to say that because she's same name as one of my former favorite students. It's brought up that it talks about the generations that we stand on the shoulders, of course, of those who came before us, and that seemed to fit beautifully with what Dr. Williams had already shared with us about needing to know the history of what had happened in the past.
Wonderful. What a wonderful connection, that a community lives in time as well as space. Wonderful. Well, thank you for studying together so thoughtfully once again. Let me simply conclude with this. My father was an imperiled outsider. He was a working class guy who married the daughter of a junk peddler. Lord knows my dad suffered, but his story and example have been a precious gift to me throughout my life. And let me say in that regard, especially inasmuch as I've never had to work as hard as my parents did, or meet the challenges they faced. And yet, despite all, they remained deeply, deeply devoted to the common good. And I think I understand at least a part of why that might be. My ancestors were the imperiled children of immigrants. My mother and father were one step ahead of the genocide that swept away their cousins, their aunts, and uncles. And they never doubted that their gratitude for the life that they had was best expressed in support of the vulnerable and imperiled all around them. People who they could honestly say are people like me. And knowing that about my ancestors, knowing that about my folks, that's made all the difference. So with that, I return things back to Sarah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Earl. Always a pleasure to learn from you and learn together in a community.
Absolutely.
I just want to wrap up again, heartfelt thanks to Dr. Uhuru Williams and Earl. For those of you who aren't familiar with Opportunity St. Paul, we provide volunteer experiences for volunteers in 6 different partner sites. We're currently working on creating COVID-safe volunteering, including virtual tutoring, virtual reading literacy from 2 of our partners. Again, we're all still waiting to hear what happens with schools, which I heard we're going to find out July 30th from Governor Walz. So keep an eye and an ear out for more information. If you know of folks who want to volunteer, please let us know. Send me an email. We're continually recruiting, trying to be as creative as possible. We also are going to increase our learning community events, so you'll get another invitation to join us in August for another learning community. It's good to be together. As we have said, it's good to see faces. So we would love you to join us again in August, and we'll be kicking off OSP virtually with our partners in September, early September, once we know what we can provide COVID-safe volunteer opportunities for all of you. Again, on behalf of Randy and the rest of the staff at Interfaith Action, I had some great support behind me tonight. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. We'll send all of the resources out to you folks once they're done, including the recording and including a PDF of the PowerPoint. So thank you. Enjoy your evening. Stay cool tomorrow and be well.